So we started this project because of the huge rise in number of requests we were getting in from supporters, members of the public, members of APRS, and inquiries about battery storage. And we took a look at a couple of them in depth. The ones that we do look at, we try and give a good answer. And one that went to Nikki, which was Lower Badakra, and one that I looked at, which was in Cockno, both had rung big alarm bells for us. And it became clear that there was something a bit wrong in the system and that we should look into it. One of them, which we'll hear a bit more about later in the presentation, the Lower Badakra one, it was really clear that ECU, Energy Consents Unit, wasn't paying attention to the National Planning Framework. And Cockno is a huge one on Greenbelt site next to the Cockno Stones. And it just seemed like the kind of place that really shouldn't be having battery storage. But it became very clear that it would have little chance to do anything, change anything by fighting one by one with the volume that's coming through. And so we set out to look at the whole system. And so as a tiny organisation, we can mobilise pretty quickly. So within a week of having that idea, I'd got these two fantastic volunteers recruited and started work. So I'm going to introduce you to them in a minute. Although haven't been paid employees, they have acted as if they are employees, and they've been working 2 to 3 days a week at this for a couple of months. But we've managed to get this report done and dusted within about 3 months of them starting. 3 to 4 months of them starting, which is pretty amazing. So I'm going to start with handing over to Katie, who is going to give us the overview of the policy and the starting point where we launched into our research project. Over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Kat. So hi everyone, I'm Katie. And as Kat said, I sort of signed up to be a volunteer in this project, and sort of it's been one of those ones that as soon as you start looking at it, it got bigger and bigger, and lots of rabbit holes were followed. But what we've got, I think, is a really good final piece of research. So I'm just going to go through the policy context to sort of set the scene. So policy around battery energy storage in Scotland is quite complex. It's influenced by both reserved and devolved policies and plans. The generation and supply of electricity is a reserved matter, and therefore the responsibility of the UK government. And while decision-making powers for renewable energy development consents, including those for battery storage, are devolved to Scottish ministers for projects over 50 megawatts, so the bigger ones, the legislation responsible for the process is also reserved to the UK government. For all intents and purposes, battery storage is classed as electricity generation. This means that smaller projects with a capacity below 50 megawatts are determined by local planning authorities under Section 25 of the Planning Act, while larger projects over 50 megawatts are decided by Scottish ministers via the Energy Consents Unit, or ECU, under Section 36 of the Electricity Act. In terms of sort of what guides decisions, at the local authority level, decisions must be made in line with the development plan, which in other words is National Planning Framework 4, NPF 4, together with the relevant local development plan or plans, unless material matters indicate otherwise. For consenting decisions made by the ECU on behalf of Scottish ministers, so that's for those larger projects that are greater than 50 megawatt capacity, the development plan, including NPF4, is a material consideration. Where a local authority objects to a battery storage or other energy installation over 50 megawatts, this triggers a public local inquiry. It's up to the local authority to pay for this inquiry. And just for comparison, in England, all battery storage planning decisions are determined by local planning authorities in the first instance, regardless of project size or capacity. Taking a closer look at NPF4. So NPF4 sets out the national planning policy on renewable energy development for Scotland, including battery storage. Policy 11 of NPF4 specifically relates to development proposals for all forms of renewable technologies. This policy provides that planning authorities should support proposals for all forms of renewable, low carbon, and zero emissions technologies, and encourages local development plans to realise their area's full potential for electricity from renewable sources by identifying opportunities and locations for energy projects to be located. The first round of local development plans informed by NPF4 are actually still being produced by local planning authorities, with public consultations on the first proposed plans likely to happen early next year. These plans may include clearer policy guidance on battery energy storage than NPF4 currently offers, but obviously we're still waiting to see once those have been to public consultation. Within Policy 11, Part E sets out a list of requirements for battery storage. It requires that project design and mitigation demonstrates how impacts, including those on communities, landscapes, public access, the environment, biodiversity, trees, as well as cumulative impacts are addressed. While Policy 11 is specific to energy developments, NPS4's policies are designed to be read and applied as a whole. Policies on green belts, brownfield first, and biodiversity enhancement, among others, should therefore be considered in decisions relating to battery energy storage. As part of our research, we looked at how much battery storage will be needed in Scotland and the UK as a whole to reach net zero targets. A lot of this is guided by the UK government's Clean Power 2030 Action Plan, which sets out a roadmap to deliver a clean electricity system by 2030 in Great Britain, with at least 95% of electricity generated from low carbon sources. The plan targets between 23 and 27 gigawatts of battery energy storage by 2030 to provide grid flexibility and reliability. That's across the whole of Great Britain, up from a level of 4.5 gigawatts in 2024. There's no breakdown for Scotland in the Clean Power Plan. However, modelling based on figures from 2024 estimated that Scotland would need up to 6.4 gigawatts of battery storage by 2030, rising to 7.6 by 2045. This modelling was carried out by the UK's National Energy System Operator, known as NESO, which is basically an independent body in charge of planning energy infrastructure across GB. We are still awaiting a response from a Freedom of Information request asking for the 2025 figures. NESO is also working on a strategic spatial energy plan for Great Britain. This is aiming to provide a pathway for electricity generation and storage types, locations, capabilities, and timings. However, we expect this plan to be very high level and it will unlikely provide a detailed enough spatial plan for energy developments in Scotland that will help decision makers and planners at either local authority or ECU level. We also looked at transmission and grid capacity. So when considering grid capacity for new battery storage in Scotland, NPF4 Policy 11 states that grid capacity should not constrain renewable energy development. It goes on to say that it is for developers themselves to agree connections to the grid with the relevant network operator, with consideration given to underground connections for grid infrastructure where possible. Transmission system capacity for new energy infrastructure has long been an issue in Scotland, though, where wind power makes up 39% of the UK's total energy generation capacity, despite the country only accounting for around 8% of the population. Scotland faces significant grid constraint due to this mismatch between where renewable energy is generated, so up on all the wind farms in the north of Scotland, and where demand for energy is concentrated largely in the southeast. This results in severe bottlenecks on north to south transmission lines. And these constraints force NESO to pay generators to curtail wind generation at the same time as paying for gas generation elsewhere in the UK to meet demand. As of today, there's a fantastic website where you can sort of go on and see how much is being spent on this sort of grid balancing. And I checked earlier today, and as of about midday today, we've spent this year, so 2025, we've spent over £1.3 billion helping to balance the grid in this way. So while we recognise that battery energy storage has an important role to play in balancing the grid, as Scotland looks to generate more of its electricity from renewable sources, we're concerned that guidelines and policies are not being followed, and that really they should be to ensure that the right developments are planned in the right places. So hopefully that's given you a bit of the sort of policy context. And I think I'm passing over to Cameron now, who's going to take us through the sort of methodology of our research.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen quickly here. Okay, so we used two main data sources. This first one here is showing the Department of Energy Security Net Zero's Renewable Energy Planning Database. It's a database that has all renewables in the planning pipeline. There are 421 records in it, in the one that we looked at, which is up to the end of Q2. We took project names, reference codes, planning authorities, and the other sort of variables there. The second is we also wanted to combine with our research the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation to see whether a lot of the applications were getting put into more deprived areas and things like that. And so we used this handy lookup tool that the Scottish government published in 2020. Fortunately, there's not a newer one, but that one we used quite well. So we wanted to look at these data sources from the perspective of the ECU primarily, but we also wanted to give a strong sample of local authority cases so that we could make accurate comparisons and see where both decision bodies were differing, really. A key thing that we noted from the applications was that as applications move into the 50 megawatt range, they go directly to the ECU, which comes with a higher cost of decision. And so we wanted to know that if there were any differences and whether operators were choosing to go in at just the 50 megawatt limit to try and get a sort of different set of circumstances on grading. So anyway, we pared down the records of 421 to 79, which was a split of all the ECU decisions we could get and a solid group of the local authority ones. And we chose them randomly to avoid selection bias just from around the 50 megawatt cutoff. So, hopefully we could compare apples with apples that way. So the main methods in collecting the actual data was reading all the documents that we could find on planning portals. So that'd be decision documents, planning statements, ecology appraisals, and all kinds of consultations they had with statutory bodies and with public, just people, and the objections that they held. And I looked at a lot of site layout schematics as well to understand what kinds of things were being built in these planning applications. I also used some keyword analysis on the long documents to see whether things like cumulative effects were being taken account of in decisions and things like that. I also, where there was missing and where there was, some clarity not really in any of the documents, used satellite imagery, so just Google Maps really. Also checked the project websites. Each project has a little website that you can go to actually, which was quite handy. So I'm just going to run through a few slides here of the actual database that we built. I'm going to show you some of the columns and the things that we added. So you can see here that we've taken some things from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero database with the counties that they're in, the planning application references. And obviously these are a bit different for each local authority one. They have their own unique codes and planning portals. Then we added in kinds of links, and this is where the bulk of a lot of the data collection was handled. Just checking if things were ticked off or not. So we've got things like if there was a significant impact on biodiversity, if an EIA was done and it was conditioned to be followed, if an EIA wasn't done, which was usually the case, the applicant did an ecology appraisal by themselves or with a third party, usually a third party. What kind of topography the land was situated on, and if there were any protections for the local biodiversity, if there was any planting or significant biodiversity enhancement. Further things we looked at were to do with the consultations. So we've got pre-application consultation events up there. We tracked from 0 to 2 or more, and the amount of objections. And I've included a little thing in the bottom right here of this slide. It's just something that I would like to know if I was watching this. But the most objected came in at 485, then 304 and 263. Of course, they were all ECU ones and all approved. But just to let you know, there's some averages there in the corner to show that obviously that data is quite skewed. We tracked more things like if the location was near a substation or other battery energy storage sites. This obviously was used in conjunction with whether the cumulative aspects of the application were considered. Again, more site topography, and if it was in the green belt, and then we've got our SIMD rankings that we can then put into vintiles, and I think we ended up with deciles in the report. Also postcodes, we ended up filling in quite a lot of these as there was a lot of missing data there, but for sort of whole database analysis, we did just use the ones that were available, obviously, because would have taken too many resources to fill in all 421 missing in that group. So there's a few more here. We've just got records of the operators, whether it was standalone storage, the development statuses, the addresses and the coordinates on the maps, which Katie was in charge of using a lot of GIS software to build some really interesting graphics in the report on density and capacity and authority locations. And then we tracked, obviously if it was the ECU or local authority, and all the way through we were keeping quite extensive notes. Yeah, so there was quite a significant amount of data cleaning that we had to do. I mentioned the postcodes before, but of the 79 that we researched more in depth, 2 of them had missing documents in the portals, and another one just didn't have a capacity listed in any of the documents, and so we left that out of calculations for capacity and things like that. But yes. When we were calculating analysis for the planning pipeline, we only used applications that were still valid in the pipeline, so not refused or abandoned, withdrawn, expired, or decommissioned. Okay, so that's everything on the data side. I think I'll
Thank you very much.
No
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Katie. That's really good. You can see how much work has gone into this. I don't think there have been many people that could have done the amount of reading of planning documents that Cameron has done over the last couple of months. So we do give a big thank you to Cameron for doing that, because I mean it's really been a lot of reading. As you can imagine, some of you are working on planning issues and you'll know how dense and uninteresting they are. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Share. Slideshow. There we are. Right, sharing. There we go. So this is actually, I should have shown that to show that's the picture of Cocknow. Some of the local people, Margaret, Jane and Gordon, standing on a rock called the Druid Stone, just overlooking where the battery storage is going to be. You can see one of the cup marks in this rock. It's a cup and ring mark rock, and it's literally right abutting. This is the field. You can see that there's one field up to the hedge, which is quite close, and then you see the trees in the very far distance. That's where the battery storage is going to go, from the fence line that you can see right next to the rock all the way to that very distant tree line that you can hardly see behind the hedge. So now this is going to be a roundup of the results. So Katie's given you the background of what we kind of would be expecting in terms of decision making. We did some statistics around how much battery energy storage there is in the planning system. So this is showing the sort of different statuses that we looked at. There's consented, refused, withdrawn, awaiting decision, operational, and under construction. So I can't actually see the whole of my screen because I've got this. Oh no, I'll move that to the bottom and then I can see it. So you can see at the top we've got a difference between energy consents unit and local planning authorities. That's numbers. The top is the numbers, the bottom is the capacity. So you can see that the numbers coming through local planning authorities are much higher, but when you put in how large they are, you see that the energy consents unit, there's much more capacity in the system through those applications. And you can see how many there are waiting decision. So you can see around half, perhaps a little less than half, is operational, under construction. Oh, consented, sorry, that's consented. Tiny bit in the middle is the refused, withdrawn, awaiting decision. And then this huge amount is, oh dear, there's a huge amount here, which is awaiting decision. So you can see that we've got a lot still to come. And that is a big takeaway, I think, from this. It's like what we've seen so far is the amount that could be consented if this continues is really big. So that's not gone down yet. There we are. So we looked at project size. We're really interested to see how many there are of different sizes. You can see this drop off that Cameron hinted at about 49.99 watts, megawatts. It drops right off, and that's because of well, actually, I'll show you this one first. Because of the fee structure, you can see that the fee jumps quite substantially from the local authority fees, which are the below 50, 25,000, and then up to 70,000 or more for taking them to ECU, and they go up from there. So comparing the numbers by project size, and then also looking at the actual capacity, then you see a different picture. You still see this drop off at 50, but you see that actually in terms of the capacity, of very, very few very big ones are driving this huge amount of capacity, which are the ones towards the right of that graph. You can see project approvals by year going up quite substantially. The energy consents unit are increasing much faster, as you can see, the dark blue going quite fast. You can see that the 2025 bar, that's for Q2. So we already know that we had 4.8 consented between the 30th of June, which is when our data set finished, and November, when I looked at it last week. So there is a large amount still being consented, but so that will come up. But if you look at the capacity, so this is the numbers, that one was the numbers, back to capacity, you can see the huge jump. There's a massive increase in the sizes of ones that are being put through the planning system. You can see that from 2024, the huge jump in capacity from energy consents unit ones is down to a few really big ones. And those 4.8 that were consented, a lot of that was down to a couple of weeks where the energy consent unit consented 7 really enormous ones. So this is something about what we should be expecting in the amount of storage capacity we may need. So this is not from us. This is from the report, which is a NESO report, the National Energy Systems Operator. And this is to try and forecast how much battery storage we'll need. And their sort of best guess of a 10-year forecast is that line, which is labelled there. And these are the figures that we took to our graph. So what we've done is we've plotted these two lines. The dark blue is what's in the planning pipeline, and the light blue is what has actually been consented. So you can see how fast it's rising. Now, the planning pipeline, we excluded those that have been withdrawn, refused, and various other things that they're not going to get constructed. We kept in the ones that were still awaiting decision, that were awaiting appeal, and various other things. But you can see that on the right of the graph, I've added the required capacity according to NESO projections for 2030 and for 2050. And you can see that we've already consented a large amount more than we need. Now, on that one, it's just about twice as much. But because of the stuff that's been consented since November, it's now nearly 3 times as much we have consented as we need by 2030, which is really quite a startling figure to show how unstrategic this approach is. the figures for this are not published, and they're not broken down in the NISO public report that gets updated. So the most recent NISO report is from 2025. Now, these figures come from 2024, and they were freedom of information requested from the Scottish Government because they weren't published as a broken down figure for Scotland. Now, they do exist in the calculations, they're just not published in the public report. Now, we have done a freedom of information request to ask for the updated figures for 2025. But at the moment, the planning pipeline capacity in Scotland is pretty much the same as the what we need for the whole of the UK by 2030. So we're looking at mega overcapacity. When you look at it for just the UK, they've got more in the pipeline than they need under the highest demand scenario by 2050. Just a little bit more. Whereas here in Scotland, it's a massive amount more. So I've got a little video here. This is a lovely map that Katie made for us. Katie did a lot of the visualizations, so we thank her for that as well. But you can see, you can zoom in and you can see, and I don't think I clicked, unfortunately I didn't click on any of these, but if you clicked on one of these symbols, you would see the details about it, where it is, what planning status it has, and things like that. So it's a really quite little handy graph, just a handy way of visualizing exactly how much there is in the planning system. So this is another lovely visualization from Katie. We looked at the number of applications and the total capacity according to local authorities. Now you can see that Highland's got the highest number, and it's also got nearly the highest capacity as well. But South Lanarkshire is showing up really, really dense there on capacity, and that's because of a few really huge battery storage that is proposed alongside wind farms that are in South Lanarkshire. There's also other very notable local authorities like Aberdeenshire, Perth and Kinross. Now, we did think of doing it by area because obviously Highland is a very large area and it's got 70 applications, but the fact is they're not equally distributed. So they're really clustered around the north coast, Caithness, down that east coast of the Highlands, and also along towards Beaulieu and around there. So there's a lot of clustering in these pictures. It's definitely not distributed evenly. One of the issues that we had was trying to find out information that wasn't mentioned in the planning documents. So one of these was green belts. We were particularly interested in green belts. It's one of our big policy areas for APRS that Nikki has been working on for a really long time. And we've had some good success on green belt protection over the years in terms of policy. And we were slightly alarmed to see battery storage being consented in green belts because it is very definitely an industrial land use of those sites. So we wanted to find out where it was. Now, Cameron found mention in a couple of documents, mainly objections, that it was green belt, but we didn't feel that those documents were very reliable at saying whether green belt was there or not, because of course you wouldn't mention it if you're a developer, because you'd rather people didn't know. So we thought we'll have to find another way. So we put in a freedom of information request to the Scottish Government with a list, very helpful list of all the applications we were looking at, and asked them to tell us, ECU to tell us which of those lay within Greenbelt. And they came back to us and said that they neither kept record of it, nor did they ask the applicants whether it was Greenbelt or not. And this took us aback. It surprised us, but it also told us a lot about ECU's approach to national planning framework priorities like Greenbelt and their other policies. We also know from another freedom of information request that was put in by Alex Neil, who is the previous, a few times ago, Cabinet Secretary that was responsible for, among other things, planning. He's been trying to get information about a battery storage system that is planned just outside of Airdrie, and he put in a freedom of information request similar to ours, but around brownfield sites. And he also found that they weren't keeping information about where nearby brownfield sites were and whether it was on greenbelt sites. So the next slide. So Cameron mentioned we were interested to look at where they were going. Were they going into more deprived communities or not? We did find a bit of a spread. There's around twice as many applications that are in more deprived communities than the median. There's about twice as many that are in the more deprived rather than the less deprived. And cumulative impact is a really big thing that we found was basically being ignored. So energy consents unit, planning authority is about the same. But what we found, we looked through a few of the energy consents unit ones in a lot of detail. And where it was mentioned, it was usually mentioned in respect of that an objection had been made by a statutory body or had been made by the community council. It wasn't that it was being weighed up against other things in the policies of NPF4. It was usually just a mention that there had been worries from correspondence around cumulative impact. So I've got a couple of things here that I thought stood out, and I'll just read them out to you. Scottish from Black Hillock, a 300 megawatt site. Scottish ministers agree with the planning authority that there would be impacts on landscape and visual amenity, but also agree that the cumulative impact would not give rise to a significant change of the landscape character. So this is one of the rare occasions that it was really mentioned in the analysis rather than just in reporting what was said. And the second one, the visual landscape and cumulative impact of the proposal would be acceptable owing to the fact it would be situated adjacent to an area already dominated by large-scale energy infrastructure. So that's for another huge one, 200 megawatts at Woodend Loch. Now, I had a look on the map and there is a substation next to it, but it is also in an area of farmland and where there's quite a lot of housing as well. So that's almost like saying, it's okay to have cumulative impact because there's loads of stuff there already, which seems a strange way of looking at cumulative impact. Here are some other things we looked at. There's more detail in the report. You can see that some of the things are very common, planting trees and shrubs, for example, and some are very rare, like in EIA was done. So we found only 6 cases where an environmental impact assessment was required to be done in all of the applications that we looked at in detail, which I think was around 79. So some of the smaller ones, perhaps you wouldn't expect it, but they also seem to be pretty randomly distributed amongst the ECU applications. There were none of the 5 really biggest ones, from 1,000 down to about 350 were required to do one. And then there were a few, 2, I think, around 200, and the rest were around 100 that were required to do it. But it seemed to be totally at random, and only 6, sorry. So you can have a little look at that. And then we looked in more detail at some of the things that were particularly of interest to us, like biodiversity net gain, which it seemed to be a very, not the situation that we had hoped to see. So for those of you who don't know about this, biodiversity, let's say enhancement rather than net gain, because that's the English wording. In Scotland, there is in NPF4, one of the policies around biodiversity is to ensure that these developments have biodiversity enhancement as part of them, and that they will only be allowed to be on green belts if they have this biodiversity enhancement. So we had a look at these, and as you can see, this one on the right, Lower Badachra, is one of the ones that got started on this. So the quote there in the decision letter was, Scottish ministers do not agree that a condition to enhance biodiversity is necessary as it goes above and beyond the mitigation required. Now, for any of you who know about NPF4, this would be a great surprise. This really doesn't abide by NPF4 principles. It isn't taking it as a whole. In fact, what we found was that a lot of decision letters referred to policy 11, which is energy, and they used that to give weight to granting the development, but they did not examine any of the other relevant policies that ought to have been looked at alongside that. So we feel that if you're going to be using NPF4 to justify your development, you need to look at all the other policies. So Strathcarrow here on the left, measures to ensure biodiversity net gain were recommended by the Planning Authority as part of a planning condition. Scottish ministers do not agree that planning conditions should be used to secure a benefit which is not linked to the development. So this is also a real kind of like gotcha moment. It's really bothersome to us that this is happening. So what we've done is we have written, along with our link colleagues on the planning group of Scottish Environment Link, we've written to the chief planner to ask for to look into this and to make it clearer what the burdens of looking at the NPF4 are for energy consents unit. One of the big worries, I think, is not just battery energy storage systems, but very large scale wind, where often developers are offering a large amount of investment in biodiversity enhancement, and that is as a sort of monetary opportunity for some conservation organisations to use it, and it is not being used. So it feels that there's a whole extra bit of work here that is above and beyond battery storage that really needs to be looked at, because we've got biodiversity targets hopefully coming down the line with our new natural environment bill. We've also got to deal with our 30 by 30 and all these kind of things that we've got to do as a country to deal with the biodiversity crisis, and this is an opportunity and it is not being used. So this is a quite a startling image, but I took it from I was looking for a picture of a battery on fire, and there was loads of them, and I didn't know what to choose. So I chose this because it comes from an insurance website, Allianz, and it's the website of an insurance company that's trying to sell their insurance for battery storage and various other energy infrastructure. So I thought it'd be quite good to show that the energy insurance industry is very aware of these challenges and hazards of lithium batteries. So what we found was that there really isn't any guidance or standards for battery storage systems. And this is a huge concern, I think, to a lot of people. And it was driving quite a lot of the questions that we've been answered is concerns about safety, concern about standards. There is no standard at the moment for these sites. So on to our policy recommendations. So firstly, a total no-brainer. We need to put large battery storage, those above 50 megawatts, on Schedule 1 of the environmental impact assessments. This would mean that every large battery storage application would be required to do an environmental impact assessment. I mean, it really should be happening. We assume that the only reason it's not is it's perhaps a new form of development that hasn't quite sort of hit that, been regulated yet. Secondly, a moratorium on all new consents for battery storage until we've got a more strategic approach. And at the moment, that's not going to damage anybody's vision of a net zero electricity system. We've got already nearly 3 times as much as we need by 2030, and the queue for being connected to the grid is up to 10 years at the moment. So we can afford to take a step back, to reassess, and to decide on a much more strategic approach. We would, in service of this, we need a spatial strategy and we need planning guidance for battery storage. And then I've got to move this thing I've got here, so I can't see. And then at the bottom, all decisions on battery storage, we feel, should be made at local authority level. At the present time, that is the case in England. There is no reason why we can't do it here in Scotland too. It would make sense. It would deal with the fact that we haven't got decision-making bearing in mind NPF4 at the moment. And it would make decision-making much more locally accountable and have more local democratic input. Next. So the next one's related to that. We believe that battery storage sites should be included in the local development planning process. Now, this is because the whole of the local development planning process is designed to take the time to speak to the stakeholders, to make a spatial plan. And this is exactly what we need for battery storage. At the moment, there's a total sort of first comes, first served, developer-led approach, and they can just go in anywhere. that they can find land that would accommodate them. It doesn't have to be anywhere that would be strategically chosen as a good place for it. Let's say, a brownfield site near to a substation in a place you need it. It is just a free-for-all. And it is, as far as we can see, a planning a bubble, because it is so easy to get planning permission for these. There's never been a case where ECU has turned one down, not standalone. There's 4 in our spreadsheet that have been turned down, and they were all on wind farms that were turned down. So it wasn't actually the battery storage that was turned down. Secondly, obviously, we need national standards on battery safety. That's got to be there. And also, at the moment, Scottish Fire and Rescue Services aren't a statutory consultee for battery storage, and we need that to happen. So that is our conclusions. Now it's time for any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. Right, and I'm going to look through these questions. I've hopefully got them on my phone here in a very easy to see way. Here we are. Right, so I'll start with these ones, then I'll move on to any that come into the chat. So Claire Marr asks, is there any updates on what the target number for the Scottish Government is for pursuing total BESS? And I mentioned that. That was, we've done a Freedom of Information request, and we will pass it round people when we have it, and we'll let you know if what the change is from before. We don't expect it to be hugely different. So Jan Nimmo is fighting a proposal for a 249 megawatt BESS on farmland at White House, Kintyre. She asks, do APRS have any advice for communities like ours other than objecting to the ECU when the application goes live? So this is a really good question, Jan, and it comes to the core of why that doing this report was useful. If ECU are consenting all battery storage, it's highly likely that yours will get consented. However, you should still object. You should put in all those objections. But what I would say is that everybody who's on this call and all of the people who are concerned about battery storage should be writing to their MSP about the report. We are coming up to a Holyrood election. There is a chance that these things can change. I think there's a lot of mail bags of MSPs that are full of people worried about battery storage. And I think it's the time that if you do email your MSP, you raise awareness of the report and what you feel you would like them to do about it. It could get into manifestos. It could make a difference in the Parliament. So, for example, it can come into debate sometimes that even if there's not an energy bill, there can be sort of opportunities for that. And of course, with the new government, or when we have had the Holyrood elections, there will be a new programme for government, which means new bills coming through. So I would say definitely object, do everything you can locally, get your local politicians involved, but most importantly, write to your MSP about changing the way these decisions are made. Helen Timperley, how can we get the ECU to mandate environmental impact assessments? Yes, well, that is a big question. So we are really working on that, lobbying for that. And it's one of the things that would be great if people were to write to MSPs, that they should say that this should happen. Also, we have seen decisions turn around. There was a data centre in Edinburgh that was going to go through without being required to do an EIA, and they have now reviewed that decision and decided to do an EIA. And that was based on local newspaper and local campaigner intervention. So these things can happen, but that was a decision that was made at local authority level rather than ECU. Is there a resource for giving actual data from energy sites that are in operation? Now, this is really difficult to find out because this is commercial in confidence data. I think, is there anybody else that knows anything? I'm looking at, if anyone knows anything, nod, if there's any other way of finding out, but I think it's commercial in confidence once it's in operation. Although you can see it for wind turbines, can't you? You can see how much they're producing. So I wonder whether we could ask for that to happen for battery storage as well, to ask how much they're storing. Anyway, that's just a thought. Okay, so Hilary Payton, how do the government or local councils benefit financially from these sites? are there financial incentives given by the developer? So I was going to ask Nikki if she had anything to add to this. No, do you? No, I think we had a little discussion about this before, and we feel that it is just the normal tax that businesses would pay. So corporation tax. We don't even know if they would be paying business rates as well, which go to the local authority. So
yes, they would.
Bob. Yeah, Bob, I forgot you're there. Bob is on our board, and Bob was a senior planner for a long, long time, and we're very grateful that he's here. Bob, would you like to just answer that a bit better?
What's in it for the local authority? That's kind of almost the question. I don't think planning authorities or even local authorities tend to view it that way, but there's undoubtedly is a bottom line in that these are businesses and they will pay business rates, and that will go to the council. So yes, there is a little bit of income there to councils in terms of the tax generation. But given the scale of these things coming forward, it's more likely that it's the Treasury that look at them and therefore influence how planning policy is being spread across the country.
Thanks, Bob. We're going to come back to Bob with a question later as well. So this is one that's definitely for Nikki. It's something we've been a bit concerned about ourselves. Can the developer use these sites for a different purpose later on, e.g. housing or a data centre?
In theory, no, not on the back of the planning permission that's been given, but these are viewed as temporary for several decades, 25 to 40 years or so. So I think there's a question in a lot of people's minds as to who's going to check in 40 years' time. But
yeah, we've got a linked question to that, Nikki, actually, which is there a legal requirement or a bond given to clean up? And also, what happens if the site operator goes bust partway through the job? Who finishes it and who pays to clean up in 40 years' time?
So Cameron might be able to give more details about how many of these developments actually have bonds attached. I don't know, but some of them certainly do. I think they're probably the bigger ones, but not all. I looked at one today that was actually turned down by Aberdeen, which didn't appear to have a bond attached. Yes, who pays the cleanup? Well, if there's a bond, then the cleanup can happen. Who knows in 40 years' time? Cameron, do you know how many have bonds? You didn't think very many.
Yeah, it's definitely not most. I would put it at around half of them have restoration bonds, and again, it's like you said, it's mostly the big ones, which it's a little bit worrying because a lot of the smaller ones will be run by smaller companies, which will be obviously more sensitive to going bust and things like that. So yeah, definitely an issue that we could look into further.
So we've got quite a lot of questions of people concerned about chemicals and safety. So Paul Davison, Charlie Baird, Lorena Thompson and Shona Patterson have all asked about things that are to do with toxic elements and safety. And this is something that we are really concerned about, and it's because there aren't those standards at the moment. And I think there's not an expectation for how they should be laid out. So someone else has asked about specific questions about how much is allowed in each storage container, what's the how far do they have to be apart, and things like this. And these are all things that just don't exist, and it's one of our big concerns. And I think that's shared across, and I think there will be some guidance coming. We're aware there's some guidance on the way. We're not quite sure exactly what form it would take and what it will cover. So I'm going to put a question to Bob. He sent a bit of a provocation to us as a question. Thank you, Bob. But I'm going to throw it back to you because you're the planner. You've said, is the ECU unaccountable? And perhaps is it also misguided? And I would like to throw that question back to you as a provocation yourself and see what you say.
Well, I suspect if you went round the 34 local authorities or 32 local authorities with 2 national park authorities and asked them, or asked specifically the directors of planning what they thought of this kind of body that's been imposed over the top of them, called the ECU, I think you find the directors of planning would not be too happy about it, because it does seem to be fundamentally anti-democratic and rather goes against the way that planning authorities work and planning authorities are meant to work, in that it sort of sucks up to government the decision, and it all seems to take place in a black box. Now, I wouldn't have questioned this so much if I saw that coming out of that black box there was something kind of balanced, say 40% refused and only 60% approved. But the statistics I receive and see, or have seen since the inception of the ECU, tend to be that the very, very large, very substantial amount of these are all just approved, which has led to a view publicly and wider around that it's a rubber stamping operation. And I don't think that's in the best interests of anyone in Scotland or in the planning system specifically. But I'll happily be corrected if anybody thinks otherwise.
Thank you, Bob. Just a couple more questions. We've got, does the database log the land use size of each battery storage? Now, we really were interested in this. As you know, some of them are very, very big. The one at Cocknow I'm aware of is around 28 hectares. So it covers a huge amount of land, and some of the other ones are similar size. But unfortunately, we couldn't find that out with the way that we're looking things. It's not necessarily. Cameron, were there some of it said the size and some not, or?
Yeah, some explicitly listed the amount of hectares that a site would comprise, and some of them didn't. And to verify that, we would need some more sophisticated sort of satellite methods than we felt was feasible.
Thanks. Someone's asked about how this enforcement of biodiversity enhancement. So this is to do with planning conditions, and Nikki has sent a link to a webinar from last year that we did specifically on planning conditions. And this is why it's so important that these things go into the planning conditions. And I think in the times where we've seen that developers themselves are offering biodiversity enhancement, which is incredibly welcome, it's more often than not going into conditions, which means that it's not going to be followed up on, and there's no way of knowing if they do it. I'm having a little look down. Any more questions? Oh, yes, that's a good question, Pamela. Could APRS provide some wording for people in local communities to use when writing to MSPs? That is a fantastic suggestion, actually. We can do that. It's often best to use your own words generally, but you can pick like some highlights out. So if we sent around just kind of some key demands or key points, you can then cut and paste that into your own email. But you've all got your own experiences to tell. So I think that's the best thing to write about, is like what your experience has been of this. So I've got another question which I'm going to put to Cameron, which is how do battery storage systems make them money? Over to you. Cameron did his degree in economics, so he's our expert here.
Yeah, no problem. They make it in a few different ways. A lot of the first generation battery sites that have been put through and are already operational make their money primarily through something called frequency services, which is basically just balancing the hertz level of the grid currently. They don't add or really store a lot of energy. They kind of just take bits and pieces off the top and top things up just to keep things running at efficient levels. But mostly nowadays, batteries are being produced for arbitrage, which is basically renewables production obviously is variable throughout the day, especially at night when solar doesn't return anything. And so a lot of batteries will usually these days go to about 4 hours, which covers most of that sort of overnight region and also a lot of, maybe doldrummy type spots in a day. And they make their money through selling stored energy back to the grid. But coming into the near future, there's going to be battery sites that are more longer term, and we could see them push to a day, maybe two. But yeah, mainly just buying and selling money back to the grid.
Yeah. So the price of electricity in the middle of the night is very, very low. So they buy the electricity when it's cheap and they sell it back when it's at peak expensive, because the electricity market is not what we see. We see the wholesale, we see the market, the retail market. It's like the same for us. If we fix it for 3 months, it's the same. But there's a fluctuating price that all these different companies are paying and buying and selling, and they make the money on the difference between those.
That's right. Yeah, it's an arbitrage
Even more
market.
questions. That's right. So Lorraine in Nairn says that there's 5 battery storage, which will all be approximately a kilometre from each other. And although NPF4 says cumulative impact should be considered, it isn't. And they all seem to be taken in isolation. What powers can be brought to bear to ensure that cumulative impact is being considered? I don't know whether, Bob, you want to reflect on cumulative impact? Oh, you're on
in
mute.
a moment.
Yeah. In a moment.
Well, unless anybody else wants to come in.
Nikki?
Can I,
Well, I can just say that there's very little about it in NPF4. That there's just cumulative impacts have got to be considered, and the government hasn't issued any guidance about that, and I think it probably should. And Nature Scott has guidance on cumulative impacts of wind farms, but not battery storage or any other infrastructure, as far as I know.
Anything
Can
to
I
add,
just
Bob?
add? I mean, given that most of these things tend to be happening in and around our major cities, and as a consequence within Greenbelt, to me that there seems to be a fundamental problem, because they're quite land hungry. I hope everyone's aware just of the kind of very basic technology that they are. Somebody described them to me as shipping containers filled with AAA batteries. Or rechargeable AAA batteries, and that's effectively what they are. But they take up huge amounts of space. They don't look good. They sterilize very, very large amounts of land that could have been used for other uses, including very, very simple greenbelt uses, which is about enhancing the environment around our cities. So they run counter to the main priorities that most planners and planning in general would normally strive to achieve. It's counterintuitive that these things should all be getting so approved. And when you look at that, there's one figure that stood out a mile in all those earlier figures, not about numbers and scale and all the rest of it. And the figure that stands out a mile, particularly in a week of, we're still within the week of the budget, was the 1.3 billion that's been paid in constraint payments to stop people generating electricity. At the moment, my suspicion is that politicians view MES as the solution to that, which clearly it isn't. They think that if there's a BESS system and enough BESS around, that perhaps we won't have to pay out 1.3 billion to, and I hope everybody on this webinar will realize who that money's going to. It's not to you and I as consumers. And they're thinking that that's perhaps the solution to it. The real answer sitting behind that is it's actually far more complicated than that. We really need to get underneath this and look at this a great deal more, given the scale of these applications coming forward. And although somebody asked, how do these people make the money? The question really more accurately is, who are the people making the money in all of this? And while I've been on the board at APRS, I've been kind of pushing hard to kind of look at this in these terms. The principal beneficiaries of what we're now having to deal with, certainly not the neighborhoods sitting around the edges of our towns, the principal beneficiaries are landowners, shareholders in the electricity companies in particular. They are the real big beneficiaries from what we're looking at. There's no great beneficiary out there that would see the consumer benefiting, albeit that we are being told they will. And in effect, what we're getting is a kind of Klondiking because of the scale of the money that potentially can be made, the rate of return on the investment that's being made. That was a bit of a rambling answer to Kat's question. But until we begin to look at it like this, I have deep suspicions of government just letting this run rip through the ECU without a great deal more scrutiny, particularly at the strategic level as to what's happening and why. And then at the individual level, at the impact it has, particularly on the land around our major cities.
Thanks, Bob.
Happy to be contradicted if anybody wishes to.
Yes, it's worth pointing out that the battery storage we're talking about is very short-term battery storage, so it's up to 4 hours max. So, and it usually discharges much quicker. So that's to balance the grid from minute to minute, which is a necessary part of having a grid with renewables in it. But there are longer-term storage which is being proposed. There are now batteries that are apparently longer-term storage. We've got a little section in it in our report. There's heat, there's also hydro, pump storage. There's a few other things that are longer than 4 hours, and that's called the long duration energy storage. So it's another sort of complexity in it, but BESS is specifically used for these sort of short-term fluctuations. So they wouldn't solve the curtailing problem. A little bit of it, but a large amount of it would need to be taken up with this longer term ones and better transmission networks. So that's the issue, I think.
Kat,
I don't disagree, Kat. But just one moment. It's just that what I said. I think it's politicians' perception that the reason these are being approved is because they think it does answer the 1.3 billion that's being paid out in constraint payments. And you're right that technically that's not what's happening. It won't work like that, but that's the perception.
Yeah. Nikki, you had something.
Sorry, quickly. There's a question in the chat from Carol. Has this report been sent to all the planning departments of all the local authorities? Sounds like a suggestion. It has.
Well, it has gone to the person who's the head of the heads of planning. So I haven't sent it individually to local authorities. I would like to, but I would need to find all those email addresses, which is very hard. But I have emailed it to Christina Cox, who's the convener of the heads of planning. So hopefully she would distribute it to her colleagues. And I actually know her because we went to a mother and baby thing together. And that was about the last time I met her. So I've sort of said long time no see, and could you send this to everybody? We've also sent it to everybody on the relevant committees of the Scottish Parliament. So it's gone to the Planning, Housing and Local Authorities Committee, or whatever that's called. It's gone to the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, and it's gone to the Net Zero Transport and Energy Committee. So I've pulled out to each of those committee members the bits of the report that will be relevant to their committee, because I think there are elements that speak to each committee. So the Rural Affairs one, it's the biodiversity enhancement. The energy one, it's obviously the overcapacity and the grid connections and all the rest of it. And obviously the planning committee, there's a huge amount of it relevant to them. So I am hoping that certainly the convener of the planning committee, Ariane Burgess, has been very interested in this. She's Highlands MSP, and she's seeing a lot of correspondence around batteries. So I am hoping that she might, both as a constituency MSP, but also as a convener of the committee, be interested in looking into the report a bit more and seeing whether any of the proposals in it might be worth examining a bit further. So we do have hope, but we really ask everybody on this call, if everyone could write to their MSPs about this report and say we really want to see the changes, it would add to a small NGO who, let's say, doesn't have much of a voice, but fortunately managed to hit the big time with the media and was even on Radio 4 Farming Today. So there you go. These are things that matter to politicians, that they see things, when they see things in the press, they think it's important. They just measure things in a different way. So we're very fortunate that we managed to make a really good impact. Is there any more questions, Nikki, that you could see? Oh, I've got another question here. I'm sorry, it's about the grid. So a question from, we'll make this the last one then, from David Lynn. he was asking about grid issues. So he was saying he was worried that basically by building these things, they're necessitating grid connections that will then need pylons. But also he was worried that where there are pylons, they might get more battery energy storage systems. Now, what we found is they tend to cluster around substations and energy generation. So those are the two places that they go, not so much just the middle of a grid line, but that might not always be the case. In terms of how they plan for the grid connections, I'm going to pass this over to Katie because she did a lot of work on this in the report, and it's a really complicated area on how they do it. At the moment, you don't have to have a grid connection before you apply, but once you've applied and got planning permission, there's an assumption that they will connect you. So that is the least strategic approach you could possibly imagine for building yourself an electricity grid. Is I've got a wind farm I've been developing in this middle of nowhere place with no connections. Now you have to build me millions and millions of pounds worth of overhead lines through this countryside. So I'm going to hand over to Katie to sort of truth check that, because she's done all the reading.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you summarized it there, Kat. So basically, in order to submit a battery application, you don't need to have gained a connection with Ofgem or NESO before getting planning permission. And then after the point you're given planning permission, you then have to reach out to get a connection. And actually, Lorraine has pointed out, she says in the chat, BESS developers are being given consent, and then because they cannot get access to the grid, they're having to submit S42 applications seeking extensions to planning permission. In your community, you've already had 3 of these applications, and the community is now requesting that the latest battery technology is now used. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's testament to how long it takes to get grid connections once planning approval has been granted. Oh, you're on mute, Kat.
Sorry, I'm on mute. One of the things we didn't cover in this report, but we could have well put some time into this, was so now we've got 3 times as much as we need in the who already granted. How do we decide which get grid connections? And I think that is the big question for NESO and whoever it is who's deciding who to prioritise, is given that we've got too much, let's prioritise for grid connections the ones that make strategic sense, and therefore we need a strategic plan that will include these in it, and some of them just won't get connected because we don't need it all. So they've made a mess is really the conclusion, and how to deal with this mess is I think is going to need a serious bit of strategic spatial planning, and then getting NESO to align their decision making, or who is it who decides the grid connections? Sorry, that's me probably not saying the right thing. Katie?
I think it's NESO. I think it's NESO.
Right. And then get them to use the strategic spatial plan to decide which ones do you get the connections. Is there a final word from anybody? Feel that I might have missed anything? Bob, do you want to say anything finally?
Well, I might add a reflection about gaining grid connection. It's kind of an anecdote, but I did quite a lot of comparison work with Denmark when I was head of planning in Aberdeen. We were twinned, and we went back and forth and talked to folk. But in Denmark, my understanding at least, my recollection is that you have to have an approved grid connection before you get planning permission. In the UK, it's the other way around. You get planning permission, and then the electricity supplier is obliged to connect you. That's the way it works. I have to say, I think the Danes have got this right, because what happens is that the planning system puts some sense into how that grid connection works.
I've got a question or a comment from Rebecca. Rebecca is also on our board. Thank you for coming. Yeah, unmute yourself and tell us what you can say.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. I just wanted to follow up on what Bob's been saying, because I've been following this very much with interest, because I was involved with the wind energy industry for many years before I retired, and this all speaks to me of repeat. in many ways, but it is absolutely incredulous that ECU is not required to do EIA. It is a European directive. It's not just a UK directive. It is actually something we agreed to do on things that have significant impacts or potentially significant impacts anywhere of any sort. And the ECU needs questioning. I don't know how we go about that or how we keep batting that point home, but it is quite amazing. And also to say something about the cumulative impacts that we've been talking about off and on through this session is that, you know, there is opportunities to do this properly, and it's not being taken unless we have a strategic approach. I mean, it's not just about BESS, it's actually about wind itself, because they're connecting often to wind industry sites that exist as well as new ones coming in, but also the way it actually affects the landscapes in a wider sense, in that we've got areas that I deal with out in southeast Scotland, which is dealing with offshore wind, dealing with cable connections, dealing with BESS and wind farm extensions, and also the trans-border transmission systems, which are in the position of being all upgraded. It's not just the line, it's the size of the pylons, of course, which will need to be bigger in order to take it down south. And it won't get down south unless someone does something about it properly. And it has to be done through a strategic approach. And that's just something I want to leave with everyone, to know that we are really behind the idea. Something more needs to be done. And it's actually really questionable that local authorities in Scotland aren't being allowed to comment on anything above 50 megawatt. It's just not fair. But if they do, if they can, and then they have to go to public inquiry and pay for it, and they're all actually in a difficult position at the moment with finances generally, are they going to take that opportunity? It's a very difficult scenario we've got, but I think we really do have to press the buttons about the lack of EIA strategically for multiple renewable energy situations.
Thank you very much, Becca. Last thing from Bob, because we're going to close this down.
All I was going to say is I stay just outside of Aberdeen, and we're very conscious anywhere up and down the east coast, the northeast coast, the Highland East Coast, that there are massive pylon applications running through communities at the moment. They are meeting massive objection from communities. Communities are up in arms, to the extent the Highland Council have now, or the North Committee of Highland Council, have objected to the latest 400 kV line going down the east coast. Angus Council have done the same. And this has all come about because of people power. They have all objected. Now, the problem is that these things go up to the Scottish Government and ultimately come down to individual reporters at public inquiries and one or two politicians. And the deficit we're dealing with here is the lack of accountability and the lack of democracy that sits within the planning system when it comes to these big applications. And the question I'd urge you all to think about is, why is that the case? Why is it that these decisions over the big developments, the nasty developments, the awkward, horrible developments, are sucked up to government, and government makes these decisions with a few people involved rather than listening to communities?
Thanks very much, Bob. So thank you everybody for coming. We will post this to our website. Hopefully it is recording. I think it is. And the other thing I wanted to say in answer to a couple of questions is what's going to come of this. I have written to the Minister, Gillian Martin, to ask for a meeting about this. And I hope to be able to bring the case that we need EIAs, that we need to change the way those decisions are made. So I will keep you all updated on what's happening, and thank you very much for coming.